Have you ever noticed how when a person returns home, it can sometimes be a very interesting experience? On some occasions, it can be a time of great joy. Every now and then, the news will run one of those stories, you've seen them, of a soldier who has been overseas someplace and then returns home to surprise the spouse or the parents or the children or some friends. And it's always a heartwarming scene, isn't it? I don't know why this one particularly comes to my mind, but I'm always reminded of one of those news clips where I saw a father soldier who had come back from Afghanistan, and he was surprising his little girl, and when she saw him across the room from her, she just suddenly broke out into a run, and she just started crying all the way. And as he swept her up into his arms, she just kept saying over and over again, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here?" Sometimes a return can be an occasion of great joy, can it? On the other hand, sometimes not so much. I've been a pastor long enough to know that even though we may want it to be so, even though we may work to make it so, sometimes when a person returns home, it doesn't always turn out exactly the way that we would like for it to turn out. Take this week as an example of what I'm talking about. The experts tell us what you already know, that the week of Thanksgiving is one of the busiest travel weeks of the entire year. According to AAA, 43.5 million people this week are projected to take a trip of over 50 miles or more. And many of these people will be returning home or going back to the place where they grew up. Some of you who are in here may be traveling this week. From the looks of the congregation, apparently many have already started out and taken their trip. Others of you who are in here will be receiving family and friends who will be traveling to you. And of course, everybody hopes that it will be a picture-perfect day, like one of those Thanksgiving grocery store commercials where everybody's gathered around the table and there's a bountiful feast and it's full of lots of joy and laughter and celebration and tender moments. Everybody hopes that it will be that way. But as you know, at this time of the year, there are always those articles in magazines or stories on the news that are titled Top 10 Tips for How to Survive the Holidays. And of course, we know that the reason that they have those is because it doesn't always turn out exactly the way that we would like for it to turn out. A person's return can sometimes be an occasion of great joy. On the other hand, sometimes not so much. It just all depends, doesn't it? Well, here in our gospel lesson this morning, Jesus tells us that when he returns in final victory, when that moment comes and the kingdom is brought into complete fulfillment, he says it's going to be a lot like that. For some, it's going to be an occasion of great joy, and for others, not so much. How so? Well, Jesus compares his return to a king who has all of the nations of the world in front of him, and then he will begin to separate the people, much the way that a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. In ancient Israel, a shepherd would often allow the sheep and the goats to graze together during the day, but then at night when they would come into the sheepfold, the shepherd would separate the sheep. He would put the sheep in one fold and he would put the goats in another fold. And Jesus said that the kingdom is going to be like that. The sheep will be on the right hand and the goats will be on the left hand. And then Jesus said the king will turn to the sheep and he will say, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom that has been prepared for you from the foundation of the world." And they will say, "Why? What did we do to deserve this?" And he will say, "Well, when I needed someone to care for me, you cared for me." And they will say, "We did?" And he will say, "Yes, you did." But then Jesus said the king will turn to the goats and he will say, "Depart from me, you who are accursed." And they will say, "Why? What did we ever do to deserve this?" And he will say, "Because when I needed someone to care for me, you did not care for me. And they will say, we didn't? And he will say, no, you didn't. And then to really emphasize his point, the king will say to them, insofar as you did or did not do it to one of the least of these, you did or did not do it to me. Now, if you pay real close attention to this parable that Jesus tells us, then you can't help but notice that Jesus tells us that when he returns in final victory, when the kingdom is brought into its complete fulfillment, it is going to be a day full of surprises. Jesus tells us that a lot of people are going to be surprised to find out what really matters in life. Let me ask you a question. What do you think really matters in life? Down through the centuries, philosophers and others have answered that question in all sorts of different ways. In the 6th century BC, Heraclitus said that it was harmony. A sense of balance and harmony is what matters most in life. In the 5th century BC, Socrates said it was knowledge. Plato said it was reason. Aristotle said it was self-realization. Epicurus said it was pleasure. Spinoza said it was self-preservation. Locke said it was self-interest. And Kant suggested that the thing that matters most in life is knowing the difference between right and wrong and good and evil. And on the list could go. What do you think really matters most in life? Just from a personal observation, when I look around at people's lives and pay attention to the way that they live their lives, the things where they spend their time, where they spend their money, what they put their mental energy into, it seems to me that the things that matter most to a lot of people are things like careers, family, home, and so forth. And maybe for you, that's exactly what it is. Maybe the things that matter most to you are things like careers and family and home and so forth. Now, these are not bad things. These are good things. And frankly, I hope that you do give some attention to your career and to your family and to your home. However, you know what Jesus seems to suggest, at least here in this parable? Jesus seems to suggest that as important as these things are, even more important are things like feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and visiting the sick and imprisoned. And of course, Jesus could have gone on and he could have talked about 100 other things. He could have talked about working with children or teens or seniors, or extending hospitality to those who are different from us racially, ethnically, religiously, or socially. He could have talked about cutting the grass for the widow next door, or helping a student get through college, or offering a listening ear to someone who was going through a rough patch. He could have talked about 100 other things, because Jesus's main point here is that in the end, what really matters most in life is not the lives we make for ourselves, but how we have become an extension of God's grace and helped others to live and find life. So Jesus said it's going to be a day full of surprises. Jesus suggests that a lot of people are going to be surprised to find all of the different ways that they have encountered him on this earth. In the parable, Jesus says that both the sheep and the goats ask the same question. When the king turns to the sheep and he says, come, and when he turns to the goats and he says, depart, and then he explains that the reason for the difference between these two things is how they treated him. Both the sheep and the goats ask the same question. They both say, when? When did we see you? And that's when the king tells them, when you did or did not do it to one of the least of these. You see, part of what I think Jesus wants us to understand in this parable is that we often encounter him in the lives of people who don't seem to look anything like him. In regard to this, one of my favorite stories is the story that Leo Tolstoy told. In one of his loveliest stories, Tolstoy told of an old cobbler by the name of Martin, who one night was reading about Christ and falls asleep, half wishing that Christ would come to visit him. And suddenly he is startled by a voice that says, "Martin, look into the street tomorrow and I will come to you." Well, the next day he finds himself constantly going to the window, hoping that it will be true, but wondering if it was just a silly dream. And once when he goes to the window, he sees a man outside sweeping snow off the streets. And he looks so cold, and so Martin invites him in to warm his hands by the fire. And the next time he goes to the window, he sees a woman, obviously poor, obviously very few resources, and she's got a baby in her hands. And the only thing she has to wrap the baby in is some sackcloth. And so they look cold and hungry, and so he invites them in and he gives them some hot food and drink. And then the next time he goes to the window, he sees a woman who is filled with anger because a little boy has just come by and stolen an apple from her, and so he tries to talk her down from her anger. As the day comes to a close, Martin is sitting in front of a solitary candle and disappointedly assumes that it was a silly dream after all. But then suddenly, out of the flicker of the flame, the figure of the snow sweeper arises. And then the figures of the young woman and her baby, and then the woman who was filled with anger arises. And Martin hears a question. "Martin, do you not know me? It is I." And suddenly the truth dawns on the old cobbler that in fact Jesus did come to visit him quietly, discreetly, and unexpectedly 3 times that day. Well, what might this look like for you and me? Maybe it'll look like you're being involved in one of the many ministries that we have here in this church, to the least and the last and the lost, those who have been broken by life, disenfranchised, dispossessed. Maybe it'll be like the man standing in front of you in the grocery store line who speaks a different language, and when he gets up to the counter, he has a question or two, but because he speaks a different language and the cashier speaks a different language, and they just start trying to go back and forth, trying to understand one another, and the line begins to back up and begins to back up, and then suddenly you may hear Jesus say, "Will you be patient with me?" Maybe it'll be like your next door neighbor who lives alone. Spouse died, children gone, the house is empty. And yes, I know you have many, many things on your agenda, many responsibilities that you have to fulfill, but you might just hear Jesus say, "Do you have time to pay me a visit? Do you have time to come in and drink a cup of coffee and just share some conversation?" Or maybe it'll be like the email that I received this week. I got an email from a single mother, a victim of Hurricane Katrina with small children, and she was needing some help to pay her motel bill because that's all she's got to live in, and if she couldn't pay her motel bill, then she and her children would be out on the streets. And maybe like me, you will hear a voice that says to you, "I know you get these emails almost every week. I know that many times they are cons. I know that you have to make choices because saying yes to one person may mean saying no to another person, but I wonder, will you continue to keep your heart open to me? Will you refuse to allow it to grow cold and hard? Will you take a chance on me?" I don't know about you, But the more I ponder this parable, the more I find myself asking, how many times have I missed an encounter with Christ because I was insensitive to the needs of the people in whom he dwells? And the question that I really find myself asking is, if Christ were to return in final victory today, would I be counted among the sheep or among the goats? Which leads to the main point that I think Jesus was really trying to get at in this parable. I think Jesus wanted us all to do some reflecting. I think he wanted us to take a long, hard look in the mirror and to ask ourselves the question, what are we doing with this precious little time that God has given us on this earth? Are we spending it all on the stuff that will eventually fade? Or are we investing some of it, a significant amount of it, in matters that will last for all eternity? Are we so busy with our agendas and with our work that we just sort of race through life, oblivious to the needs of other people? Or are we available to be used by Christ, whenever, wherever, and to whomever he needs us? Ultimately, we are saved not by works of the law. We are saved by grace. And aren't we glad? But here in this parable, I think Jesus is reminding us that in the words of James, faith without works is dead. In other words, if your faith doesn't find expression by reaching out to the people around you, then you have to wonder, is it really faith after all? Or is it, in the words of the Apostle Paul, the form of religion without the power of it? And the reason I think Jesus wants so desperately for us to understand this is because when he returns in final victory, when the kingdom is brought into complete fulfillment, the only surprise we get, he wants for it to be a good one. And that, my dear brothers and sisters, is the good news for this morning. Our gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for your love and for your mercy. And now, oh God, allow your love and your grace not just to be received by us, but help us to become an extension of that love and grace to all that we encounter. Open the eyes of our hearts that we might see others and that we might see you. In the name of Christ we pray, amen.